I'm Emma Rodriguez, 29, standing behind a towering pine tree at Millerton Lake, watching my entire family pose for their annual reunion photo without me. Move a little closer together, my dad Bob calls out, adjusting his baseball cap while completely ignoring the empty space where I should be standing. 23 cousins, aunts, uncles, and siblings all smiling for the camera, and I'm hidden behind a tree like some kind of family secret they're ashamed to acknowledge. 3 days later, when Grandpa Mike's will was read aloud in that same cabin, their faces went from smug satisfaction to absolute shock in less than 30 seconds. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Rodriguez family has been gathering at our lakeside cabin in Millerton Lake every July for the past 25 years, a tradition that started when Grandpa Mike bought the property back in 1999. Growing up, these reunions were the highlight of my summer. 2 weeks of swimming, fishing, barbecues, and endless card games with my cousins, while the adults told stories late into the night around the fire pit. Our family runs deep in Fresno's Central Valley community. Grandpa Mike started Rodriguez Landscaping and Garden Center in 1972, with nothing but a beat-up pickup truck and a dream to create something lasting for his family. By the time I was born, the business had grown to 3 locations across the valley, employing over 40 people and serving as a cornerstone of the local Latino business community. The success came from Grandpa's philosophy of hard work, family loyalty, and never forgetting your roots. My father Bob took over the business when Grandpa Mike stepped back in 2018, running it with the same iron-fisted dedication, but perhaps lacking some of his father's warmth and vision. Mom Patricia, or Patty as everyone calls her, manages the administrative side while also maintaining her role as the family's emotional center, always making sure everyone feels included and loved. My older brother Daniel, 32, works as the operations manager and is clearly being groomed to eventually take over from Dad. He's got Dad's serious demeanor and Grandpa's natural leadership abilities, making him the obvious heir to the family empire. My younger sister Sophia, 26, chose a different path by becoming a kindergarten teacher, but she stayed local in Fresno and married her high school sweetheart last year. Even though she's not directly involved in the business, she's still considered the good daughter, because she remained close to home and maintains regular involvement in family activities. She hosts Sunday dinners, remembers everyone's birthdays, and never misses a family gathering. Then there's me, the middle child who somehow became the family disappointment. While my siblings were content to build their lives within the familiar boundaries of Fresno and the Central Valley, I felt called to something different. Environmental activism and nonprofit work had captured my imagination during college, and after graduating from UC Davis with a degree in environmental science, I made what my family considered the ultimate betrayal. I moved to Portland, Oregon, to work for a climate change advocacy organization. The move wasn't meant as a rejection of my family or heritage. Portland offered opportunities to work on environmental justice issues that directly impacted Latino communities like ours, fighting against industrial pollution in agricultural areas and advocating for sustainable farming practices. I thought my family would understand that I was still fighting for people like us, just on a different front. Instead, they saw my relocation as abandonment, a selfish choice that prioritized my personal ambitions over family obligations. The distance became more than just geographical. Phone calls with my parents grew shorter and more surface level. Family group chats would go quiet when I contributed, and invitations to local events stopped coming altogether. When I visited for holidays, conversations felt stilted and forced, as if everyone was being polite to a stranger rather than welcoming home a daughter and sister. The tension reached a breaking point during last year's reunion when I tried to share some of the work I was doing with farmworker advocacy. Uncle Tony interrupted me mid-sentence, saying, "That's nice, Emma, but when are you going to come back to reality and help with something that actually matters to this family?" The comment stung, but what hurt more was the silence from everyone else, their lack of defense or even acknowledgement that my work had value. This year's reunion felt different from the moment I arrived. Usually Grandpa Mike would be the first to greet me, his weathered hands pulling me into a bear hug while he asked detailed questions about my life in Portland. He was the only family member who seemed genuinely interested in my work, often asking me to explain environmental policies, or sharing newspaper clippings he'd saved about climate change issues. His absence hung over everything like a heavy fog. Grandpa Mike had passed away 3 months earlier, in April, after a brief battle with pneumonia. His death hit the family hard, but it seemed to hit me differently than the others. While they grieved the loss of their patriarch and business founder, I grieved the loss of the only family member who truly understood my path. He'd been my secret ally, the one who would slip me $20 during family gatherings and whisper, "Keep fighting the good fight, Mija. The world needs people like you." The reunion began normally enough. Aunt Carmen had prepared her famous tamales, Uncle Tony was setting up the horseshoe pit, and my cousins were already planning the annual fishing tournament. But I noticed something strange. Whenever someone pulled out a camera, I somehow ended up being asked to take the photo rather than be in it. "Emma, you're so good with cameras," Sophia would say, handing me her phone. "Can you get a shot of me and the girls?" At first, I thought it was coincidence. Maybe I was just in the right place at the right time to help with photos. But as the day progressed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Group photos of the cousins, the siblings, the whole extended family, and somehow, I was always the one behind the camera or mysteriously absent when the shot was taken. The most painful moment came during the traditional family portrait, the big group photo that gets framed and displayed in everyone's homes for the next year. This photo is serious business for the Rodriguez family, with specific positioning based on family hierarchy and careful attention to making sure everyone looks their best. Grandpa Mike had always insisted on this photo, saying it was proof of the family's strength and unity. As everyone gathered on the cabin's large front porch, I moved toward my usual spot between Sophia and my cousin Bella. Dad held up his hand, stopping me. "Emma, would you mind taking the family photo this year? You know how to work Daniel's fancy camera better than the rest of us." The request seemed reasonable enough, but something about his tone felt off. Too casual for such an important family tradition. I looked around at my family members, searching for any sign that someone would object, that someone would insist I belonged in the photo too. Mom avoided my eyes, suddenly very interested in adjusting Sophia's hair. Daniel busied himself with his camera settings. Even my cousins, who I'd grown up with like siblings, seemed to be looking everywhere except at me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about photography skills or doing a favor for the family. They were deliberately excluding me from the family portrait, literally erasing me from the visual record of who belonged in the Rodriguez family. After 29 years of being Grandpa Mike's granddaughter, Bob and Patty's daughter, and Daniel and Sophia's sister, I was being quietly written out of the family story. My hands trembled as I took the camera from Daniel, but I managed to keep my voice steady. "Sure, no problem." I positioned myself behind the camera, looking through the viewfinder at the faces of people I'd loved my entire life, people who apparently no longer considered me truly part of their family. As I focused the lens, I noticed how easily they filled the space where I should have been standing, how naturally they arranged themselves without me, as if I'd never belonged there at all. The photo session continued for what felt like hours. Different groupings, different poses, different combinations of family members. The adults, the kids, the siblings, the cousins, the married couples, the business partners. Every possible variation of the Rodriguez family, except any that included me. I became the invisible family member, present but not acknowledged, helpful but not valued, there but not belonging. That evening, as everyone gathered around the fire pit for stories and s'mores, I found myself sitting slightly outside the circle, not because there wasn't room, but because no one seemed to notice whether I was there or not. The conversations flowed around me like water around a stone, never quite including me but never explicitly excluding me either. I was experiencing something worse than outright rejection. I was being treated like I didn't matter enough to reject. The next morning brought the reading of Grandpa Mike's will, an event that nobody had expected to happen during the reunion. The family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, had called Mom the night before, explaining that Grandpa Mike had specifically requested that his will be read aloud to the entire family during the reunion weekend. He wanted everyone together when his final wishes were shared, Mr. Henderson had explained. We gathered in the cabin's main room, the same space where we'd held countless family meetings over the years. The atmosphere was somber but not particularly tense. Everyone expected a straightforward division of assets. The business would go to Dad, the lake cabin would remain family property, and various personal items would be distributed among the grandchildren. Grandpa Mike had been practical about everything in life, so we assumed his death would be handled with the same straightforward approach. Mr. Henderson, a tall man with kind eyes who had been the family's lawyer for over 2 decades, spread several documents across the coffee table. Miguel Rodriguez left very specific instructions about how he wanted his estate handled, and he asked that I read certain portions aloud to ensure there were no misunderstandings. He began with the standard legal language, the formal declarations that make up the beginning of any will. Then he moved to the specific bequests, and this is where things began to get interesting. To my son Robert, I leave the family business, Rodriguez Landscaping and Garden Center, with the understanding that it will continue to serve our community and provide employment for those who need it most. Dad nodded solemnly, accepting the responsibility he'd been preparing for his entire adult life. The business was his life's work, his identity, and his legacy to pass on to Daniel someday. To my daughter-in-law Patricia, I leave my coin collection and my thanks for the love and stability she brought to our family. Mom wiped away a tear, touched by the recognition of her contributions to the family's success. Mr. Henderson continued through various smaller bequests. Daniel received Grandpa's tools and workshop equipment. Sophia got his extensive cookbook collection, and the family recipes that had been passed down through generations. Various cousins received personal items that held special meaning. Then Mr. Henderson paused, looking directly at me for the first time since he'd arrived. To my granddaughter, Emma Rodriguez, I leave the lake cabin property, including all buildings and the surrounding 15 acres, along with the investment portfolio that I established specifically for the maintenance and improvement of this property. The room went completely silent. I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I'd just heard. The lake cabin wasn't just a vacation home. It was the heart of our family's identity, the place where all our most important memories had been made. The property was worth easily $500,000, and the investment portfolio Mr. Henderson mentioned was apparently substantial enough to maintain it indefinitely. But Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Henderson wasn't finished. Mr. Rodriguez also asked me to read this personal letter he wrote specifically for today. He unfolded a piece of paper covered in Grandpa Mike's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script that had appeared on my birthday cards every year. My dear family, Mr. Henderson began reading. If you are hearing this, then I am gone, and you are gathered together at the lake cabin for what I hope will be the first of many reunions that Emma will host for all of you. The mention of my name hosting future reunions caused several family members to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This was clearly not what they had expected to hear. I am leaving the cabin to Emma because she is the only one among my grandchildren who truly understands what family means. While others have focused on maintaining traditions and staying close to home, Emma has shown me that family love means fighting for something bigger than yourself, even when that fight takes you far from home. I could feel every eye in the room turning toward me, but I kept my gaze fixed on Mr. Henderson, afraid that if I looked at anyone else, I might break down completely. Emma's work in environmental advocacy is not a rejection of our family or our heritage. It is the highest expression of our family values, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, fighting for justice, and working to make the world better for the next generation. She has never forgotten where she came from, but she has had the courage to go where she was needed most. The lawyer paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. I have watched this family treat Emma as if her choices were somehow less valuable than staying home and following the expected path. I have seen how she has been made to feel like an outsider at gatherings, how her contributions are minimized, and how her presence is taken for granted. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Grandpa Mike had seen everything, had understood exactly what was happening, and had chosen to address it in the most public way possible. The lake cabin represents everything our family stands for: gathering together, supporting each other, and creating space for everyone to belong. Emma understands this better than anyone because she has experienced what it feels like to be excluded from the family she loves. She will ensure that this place remains welcoming to all family members, regardless of the paths they choose in life. Mr. Henderson looked up from the letter, scanning the faces of my family members before continuing. There's more. I am also leaving Emma my personal investment accounts, totaling approximately $800,000, because I trust her judgment about how to use money to help people. Her work has shown me that she understands the responsibility that comes with resources, and I know she will use this inheritance wisely. The room erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs. The total value of what Grandpa Mike had left me was well over $1 million, making it by far the largest portion of his estate. But more than the money, it was the public declaration of his faith in me, his explicit recognition of my worth, and his pointed criticism of how the family had treated me. Finally, Mr. Henderson continued, I want to address the elephant in the room. Emma has been made to feel unwelcome at family gatherings, excluded from photos, and treated as if her life choices were somehow a betrayal of family values. This treatment breaks my heart and dishonors everything our family claims to stand for. I could hear Sophia starting to cry, and I saw Mom covering her face with her hands. Dad's jaw was clenched so tight I thought it might break. Emma, Mija, I hope you will use the cabin to bring this family back together. Show them what real inclusion looks like. Teach them that family love is not conditional on staying close to home or following prescribed paths. Help them understand that supporting each other's dreams is what makes a family strong. The lawyer folded the letter carefully and looked around the room. That concludes the reading of Miguel Rodriguez's will. There are some additional legal documents to review, but the main provisions are clear. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, stunned, holding the keys to the property that had been the center of our family's identity for 25 years. The same family that had spent the weekend making me feel invisible had just learned that their beloved patriarch considered me the most trustworthy guardian of their gathering place. Aunt Carmen was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma, we didn't know how Grandpa Mike felt about your work. Uncle Tony, who had dismissed my environmental advocacy so harshly the year before, looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He never said anything to us about how we were treating you. But it was Dad's reaction that broke my heart. This strong, proud man who had built his identity around being the responsible son, the business leader, the family provider, looked completely lost. Emma, I don't understand. We didn't mean to make you feel excluded? I finished for him, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Like I didn't belong? Like my life choices were somehow less valuable than everyone else's? Mom finally looked up from her hands, her eyes red with tears. We thought you were rejecting us by moving so far away. We thought you didn't want to be part of the family anymore. The conversation that followed was painful, honest, and long overdue. Family members took turns acknowledging how they had treated me, apologizing for assumptions they had made, and expressing regret for the distance that had grown between us. Sophia admitted that she had been jealous of my independence and had used the family's disapproval as a way to make herself feel superior. Daniel confessed that he had been afraid my different path would somehow reflect poorly on his more traditional choices. But the most important conversation was with Dad. As the family gradually dispersed to process what had happened, he approached me on the cabin's front porch, the same place where I had been excluded from the family photo just 2 days earlier. Emma, I owe you an apology that's about 20 years overdue, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I was so focused on keeping the family together in the way I understood it that I couldn't see how I was pushing you away. Your grandfather was right about you, about your work, about everything. We talked until the sun set over the lake, sharing perspectives we had never been able to discuss before. Dad explained his fears about the family business struggling, his worries about maintaining the legacy Grandpa Mike had built, and his confusion about my choices. I shared my passion for environmental justice, my love for the family despite feeling unwelcome, and my dreams for using my inheritance to create positive change. By the end of our conversation, something fundamental had shifted between us. We weren't going to agree on everything, and we weren't going to have a perfect relationship overnight, but we had found a foundation of mutual respect that had been missing for years. The next morning, I gathered the family together for a new photo on the cabin's front porch. This time, I was in the picture, standing proudly among the people I loved, holding the keys to the property that would allow me to ensure our family gatherings continued for generations to come. As I looked around at my family's faces, I realized that Grandpa Mike had given me something more valuable than money or property. He had given me the power to redefine what family meant, to create a space where everyone could belong regardless of the paths they chose, and to show that love is not about conformity, but about supporting each other's authentic selves. The lake cabin would remain the heart of our family's identity, but now it would be a heart that beat with inclusion rather than exclusion, with celebration of differences rather than punishment for them, and with the understanding that family love grows stronger when it embraces, rather than restricts the dreams of its members. Standing there with my family, holding the keys to our future gatherings, I finally understood what Grandpa Mike had been trying to teach us all along, that the strongest families are not those that stay together by force, but those that choose to stay together by love, respect, and the courage to grow. Growing up as the middle child in the Rodriguez household meant navigating a complex web of expectations, traditions, and unspoken rules that had been established long before I was born. Our family home on Maple Street in Fresno was a sprawling ranch-style house that Grandpa Mike had purchased in 1985, back when the neighborhood was still considered the outskirts of town. The house had grown with the family's success, with additions and renovations that reflected each milestone in the landscaping business. The heart of our home was the kitchen, where Mom Patricia held court every Sunday afternoon, preparing elaborate meals that brought together not just our immediate family, but also aunts, uncles, cousins, and anyone else who needed a place to belong. The kitchen walls were covered with family photos spanning decades, school awards, business milestones, and newspaper clippings about Rodriguez Landscaping's community involvement. The refrigerator was a bulletin board of family life, displaying everything from grocery lists to grandchildren's artwork to appointment reminders. Our dining room table could expand to seat 16 people, a necessity given the size of our extended family and Mom's open-door policy for anyone who needed a meal. Sunday dinners were mandatory for family members living in Fresno, and even those who had moved away were expected to attend whenever they were in town. These gatherings weren't just about food, they were about maintaining connections, sharing news, discussing business matters, and reinforcing the family hierarchy that kept everyone in their proper place. Dad Bob commanded respect through his presence rather than his words. He was a man of few sentences but profound impact, someone who could convey approval or disappointment with just a look. His authority came from his role as the family provider and his position as heir to Grandpa Mike's business empire. When Dad spoke, everyone listened, and when he made decisions, they were rarely questioned. His word was law, and his vision for the family's future was treated as gospel. The business aspect of our family life was impossible to separate from the personal relationships. Rodriguez Landscaping wasn't just Dad's job, it was the family's identity and primary source of pride. The 3 locations employed numerous family members, from Uncle Tony, who managed the nursery operations, to Cousin Marco, who handled the commercial contracts. Even family members who worked elsewhere were expected to contribute during busy seasons, helping with inventory, answering phones, or pitching in wherever needed. Daniel's role as the chosen successor was established early and reinforced constantly. From the time he was 12 years old, he spent summers working at the garden centers, learning every aspect of the business, from plant care to customer service to financial management. His bedroom was filled with business books, trade magazines, and certificates from horticulture courses. Family conversations often centered around Daniel's latest achievements, his innovative ideas for business expansion, or his growing expertise in sustainable landscaping practices. Sophia's position as the beloved youngest daughter came with different expectations but equal importance. She was expected to be the family's social coordinator, the one who remembered birthdays, organized celebrations, and maintained relationships with extended family members. Her natural warmth and organizational skills made her perfect for this role, and she seemed to thrive on being the center of family communication. Her decision to become a teacher was viewed favorably because it aligned with traditional female roles and because she planned to remain local. My place in this family structure was always less clearly defined and more problematic. As the middle child, I didn't have Daniel's obvious destiny or Sophia's natural charm. I was academically gifted, but in ways that seemed impractical to my parents. While Daniel studied business and horticulture, I was fascinated by environmental science and policy. While Sophia planned local community events, I was reading about global climate change and social justice movements. The tension started early, during my high school years when I began questioning some of the family's business practices. I remember asking Dad during one Sunday dinner why we used certain pesticides that I had read were harmful to beneficial insects. His response was swift and dismissive. "Emma, when you've been in this business for 30 years like I have, then you can start giving advice about how to run it." The message was clear. My academic knowledge was less valuable than practical experience, and my questions were seen as criticism rather than curiosity. My relationship with Grandpa Mike was different from the beginning. While Dad and the rest of the family saw my environmental interests as impractical idealism, Grandpa Mike seemed genuinely curious about what I was learning. He would pull me aside during family gatherings and ask me to explain concepts like carbon sequestration or sustainable agriculture. He never made me feel like my interests were silly or worthless, and he often shared stories about how farming and landscaping practices had changed during his lifetime. These conversations with Grandpa Mike were precious to me because they were the only times I felt truly heard and valued for my intellectual curiosity. He would tell me about the changes he had witnessed in California's Central Valley, the impact of development on local ecosystems, and his concerns about water usage in landscaping. He seemed to understand that my environmental awareness wasn't a rejection of the family business, but rather a different way of thinking about the same issues he had been grappling with for decades. The cultural expectations in our Latino family added another layer of complexity to my struggle for identity and acceptance. Traditional gender roles were still strongly enforced, despite the family's economic success and integration into mainstream American society. Women were expected to prioritize family relationships over individual ambitions, to maintain harmony rather than create conflict, and to support the men's decisions rather than challenge them with alternative viewpoints. My academic achievements were celebrated to a point, but always with the underlying assumption that education was preparation for a supporting role rather than leadership. When I earned a full scholarship to UC Davis, the family's response was pride mixed with anxiety. They were proud of my academic success, but worried about what 4 years away from home might do to my family loyalties and traditional values. College was indeed transformative, but not in the way my family feared. Rather than rejecting my cultural heritage, I became more aware of how environmental issues disproportionately affected Latino communities like ours. I learned about the high rates of asthma and other health problems in agricultural areas, the impact of pesticide exposure on farm workers, and the connection between environmental degradation and social justice. My studies weren't leading me away from my community. They were giving me tools to better serve it. Unfortunately, my family couldn't see this connection. When I tried to share what I was learning during visits home, I was met with polite disinterest at best and outright hostility at worst. My passion for environmental justice was interpreted as criticism of the family business and rejection of the community that had raised me. The more educated I became, the more alienated I felt from the people I loved most. The summer after my junior year was particularly difficult. I had been accepted for an internship with a nonprofit organization that worked on environmental health issues in Latino communities. The position would have provided valuable experience and connections for my future career, but it required me to remain in Northern California rather than return home to help with the family business during its busiest season. When I explained the opportunity to my parents, their reaction was immediate and negative. Dad saw it as a betrayal of family obligations, while Mom worried about me getting involved with radical organizations that might fill my head with dangerous ideas. Sophia chimed in with concern about me becoming too different from the family, too educated and worldly to relate to the people who had raised me. The argument that followed was one of the worst we had ever had. Accusations and hurt feelings flew back and forth, with each side feeling misunderstood and unappreciated. Dad accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, using my education to look down on the family that had sacrificed to provide it. I accused him of being closed-minded and unwilling to consider that there might be value in perspectives different from his own. Grandpa Mike was the one who finally mediated a compromise. He suggested that I take the internship but commit to spending 2 weeks helping with the family business when I returned. He also proposed that I give a presentation to the family about what I learned during my internship, so they could better understand the work I was passionate about. Both sides reluctantly agreed to this arrangement, though neither was entirely satisfied. The internship was everything I had hoped it would be and more. I worked with community organizers, environmental scientists, and policy advocates who were addressing exactly the kinds of issues I wanted to focus on in my career. I learned about the intersection of environmental health and social justice, the importance of community-based solutions, and the power of grassroots organizing to create meaningful change. When I returned home that fall, I was full of enthusiasm and new ideas. I had prepared a detailed presentation about my internship experience, complete with photographs, statistics, and specific examples of how environmental advocacy could benefit communities like ours. I was excited to share what I had learned and to help my family understand why this work was so important to me. The presentation was scheduled for a Sunday family dinner, giving me an audience of about 25 family members. I had spent weeks preparing, anticipating questions, and thinking about how to connect my environmental work to the values and concerns that mattered most to my family. I saw this as an opportunity to bridge the gap between my academic interests and the practical realities of our family's life and business. The evening started promisingly. Family members seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my summer experience, and several aunts and uncles asked thoughtful questions about the organization where I had worked. I felt hopeful that finally, after years of feeling misunderstood, I would be able to help my family see the value and importance of environmental advocacy. As I began explaining the connection between environmental health and community well-being, I noticed some uncomfortable shifting in the audience. When I mentioned the health impacts of certain pesticides commonly used in landscaping, Dad's expression grew increasingly dark. When I talked about the importance of sustainable business practices, Uncle Tony began shaking his head dismissively. The turning point came when I enthusiastically described a project I had worked on that helped a community challenge a proposed development that would have increased air pollution in their neighborhood. I thought this was a perfect example of how environmental advocacy could protect families like ours, but Uncle Tony interrupted me with a sharp question. So you're saying that stopping development and business growth is more important than jobs and economic opportunity? I tried to explain that environmental protection and economic development didn't have to be mutually exclusive, that sustainable practices could actually benefit both community health and business success. But I could see that I was losing the audience. Family members who had seemed interested and supportive just minutes earlier were now looking skeptical and defensive. The final blow came when Aunt Carmen asked directly, "Emma, are you saying that our family business is harming the community? Are you saying that everything your father and grandfather have built is wrong?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized that despite all my preparation and good intentions, I had failed to communicate my message in a way that didn't feel like an attack on the family's livelihood and legacy. I tried to recover, to explain that I wasn't criticizing the family business but rather suggesting ways it could be even better, even more aligned with community values and environmental responsibility. But the damage was done. The rest of the presentation felt awkward and forced, with family members asking polite but pointed questions that felt more like interrogations than genuine curiosity. After the presentation, the family's reaction was mixed, but mostly disappointing. A few younger cousins expressed interest in learning more about environmental issues, but the older generation seemed to have concluded that my education had indeed filled my head with impractical ideas that were incompatible with real-world business responsibilities. Dad's feedback was particularly crushing. He pulled me aside after most of the family had left and said, "Emma, I can see that you're passionate about these issues, and I respect that. But I need you to understand that criticism of businesses like ours, even well-intentioned criticism, can be harmful to the people who depend on those businesses for their livelihoods. Sometimes it's better to focus on supporting what works, rather than trying to fix what isn't broken." That conversation marked the beginning of a gradual but steady deterioration in my relationship with the family. I continued to participate in family gatherings and maintain regular contact, but there was an underlying tension that hadn't existed before. I felt like I had to be careful about what I said and how I said it, constantly monitoring my words to avoid triggering another confrontation about my radical ideas. The situation became more complicated as I moved closer to graduation and began making plans for my post-college life. My academic advisors were encouraging me to apply for graduate programs or seek positions with environmental organizations, opportunities that would almost certainly require me to remain in Northern California or move to other parts of the country where environmental advocacy was more established. Meanwhile, my family's expectations remained unchanged. They assumed that once I had gotten my education out of my system, I would return to Fresno, find a practical job that utilized my degree without challenging family values, and settle into the role of supportive daughter and sister. The possibility that I might choose to build my life elsewhere, pursuing work that felt meaningful to me even if it wasn't valued by the family, seemed inconceivable to them. The tension came to a head during the Christmas break of my senior year. I had been accepted to several graduate programs and had received job offers from environmental organizations in different parts of the country. I was excited about these opportunities and eager to share my good news with the family, but their reaction was not what I had hoped for. Instead of celebrating my achievements, they seemed to view them as threats to family unity and evidence that I had become too educated and ambitious for my own good. Sophia worried that I was making choices that would make it impossible for me to maintain close family relationships. Daniel expressed concern that my career path would make it difficult for me to contribute to the family business or support our parents as they aged. Mom's reaction was perhaps the most painful. She had always been my biggest supporter, the one who encouraged my academic pursuits and defended my right to explore different interests. But faced with the reality that I might actually leave California permanently, she became tearful and pleading. "Emma, Mija, can't you find a way to do this environmental work closer to home? Can't you use your education to help the family business become more environmentally friendly? Why do you have to go so far away to make a difference?" The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of my work and my career goals. Environmental advocacy wasn't something I could do as a hobby or side project while maintaining a primary focus on family obligations. It required the same kind of dedication and single-minded focus that Daniel brought to learning the landscaping business, the same commitment that Dad had shown in building the family's success. But my family couldn't see this parallel. They viewed Daniel's career focus as responsible and mature, while seeing mine as selfish and impractical. They supported his decision to dedicate himself to mastering every aspect of the business, but they saw my similar dedication to environmental work as evidence that I valued my personal ambitions more than family relationships. The double standard was particularly evident in how they discussed my future compared to Daniel's. His career plans were treated as natural extensions of family values and community service, while mine were seen as personal choices that prioritized individual fulfillment over family responsibility. The same ambition that was praised in my brother was criticized in me, and the same dedication that was seen as admirable in his case was viewed as excessive in mine. As graduation approached, I felt torn between my desire to pursue meaningful work and my love for my family. I had opportunities to make a real difference in environmental advocacy, to work on issues that I believed were crucial for the future of communities like ours. But taking advantage of these opportunities would require me to disappoint people I loved, to make choices that they would interpret as rejection and abandonment. The decision to move to Portland after graduation was not made lightly or without consideration of the family's feelings. I had researched the environmental organization thoroughly and was impressed by their work on environmental justice issues that directly impacted Latino communities. The position would allow me to use my education to address the same kinds of health and environmental challenges that affected my own family and community, even if they couldn't see the connection. I tried to explain this to my parents, to help them understand that my work in Oregon would still be focused on helping people like us, just from a different location and with different tools. But they couldn't get past the geographical distance and the fact that I would be working with people they didn't know, on issues they didn't fully understand, in ways that didn't directly benefit the family business or the Fresno community. The goodbye when I left for Portland was awkward and painful. There were tears and hugs, expressions of love and concern, but also an undercurrent of disappointment and disapproval that made the departure feel more like a betrayal than a natural step toward independence. I drove away from the family home with a heavy heart, knowing that I was making the right choice for my career and personal growth, but also knowing that this choice would create distance between me and the people who had shaped my identity and values. The first year in Portland was both exhilarating and lonely. The work was everything I had hoped it would be, challenging and meaningful, and directly connected to the issues I cared most about. I was working with brilliant, dedicated people who shared my passion for environmental justice, and I was learning skills and gaining experience that would serve me well throughout my career. But the professional satisfaction was accompanied by personal isolation. I missed my family terribly, missed the warmth and chaos of Sunday dinners, missed the sense of belonging that came from being part of a large, tight-knit extended family. I tried to maintain regular contact through phone calls and visits, but the conversations felt increasingly strained and superficial. My parents asked about my job with polite interest, but never seemed to really understand what I was doing or why it mattered. They updated me on family news and business developments, but I could tell they were editing their stories, leaving out details that might be interesting to someone who was truly part of the family's inner circle. I was being kept informed but not truly included, treated as an outsider who deserved basic courtesy but not intimate connection. The pattern that would define my relationship with the family for the next several years was established during that first year in Portland. I remained technically part of the family, invited to major events and included in group communications, but I was no longer central to the family's daily life or decision-making processes. I had become a peripheral figure, someone who was acknowledged but not essential, remembered but not prioritized. This shift in my family role was subtle, but profound. I noticed it in small ways: being the last to hear about family news, having my opinions sought less frequently, being assigned less important roles in family celebrations. It wasn't malicious or intentional, but it was unmistakable. I had chosen a path that took me away from the family's center of gravity, and they had adjusted their orbit accordingly. The annual family reunion at Millerton Lake became both a highlight and a source of anxiety for me. It was the one time each year when I could reconnect with extended family, catch up on everyone's lives, and remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than myself. But it was also where the changes in my family status were most apparent, where the distance I had created through my choices was most visible and painful. Each year, I approached the reunion with renewed hope that this would be the time when my family would finally understand and accept my career choices, when they would see the value in the work I was doing and welcome me back into the inner circle of family life. And each year, I left feeling more isolated and misunderstood than before, more convinced that I had sacrificed family acceptance for personal fulfillment. The reunion planning process itself reflected my changing status within the family. In the past, I had been involved in organizing activities, coordinating meal preparations, and helping with the logistics of bringing together 40 or 50 people for a week-long gathering. But as the years passed, I found myself increasingly excluded from these planning discussions, informed about decisions rather than consulted about them. When I asked Sophia about how I could help with the reunion preparations, she would assure me that everything was under control and that I should just focus on enjoying my time off from work. The message was clear. I was now a guest at family gatherings rather than a participant in family life, someone to be accommodated rather than someone whose input was valued or needed. This shift in my role was particularly painful because it seemed to confirm my family's belief that I had chosen my career over family commitments. By focusing on my environmental work, I had apparently forfeited my right to be involved in family decisions and responsibilities. The very independence that I had fought to achieve was being used as evidence that I didn't really care about family relationships. The irony was that my work was actually making me more aware of the importance of family and community connections, not less. My environmental advocacy was motivated by a desire to protect the health and well-being of families like mine, and my understanding of social justice was deeply rooted in the values I had learned from my parents and grandparents. But my family couldn't see these connections, couldn't understand that my work was an expression of their values rather than a rejection of them. As the years passed, I found myself caught in an impossible bind. I loved my family deeply and wanted to maintain close relationships with them, but I also needed to pursue work that felt meaningful and important to me. The career that gave me purpose and satisfaction was the same career that created distance between me and the people I loved most. Every professional success felt like a personal failure. Every step forward in my advocacy work felt like a step away from family acceptance. The situation reached a crisis point during my third year in Portland, when I was offered a promotion that would require me to travel frequently and take on more visible leadership responsibilities within the environmental organization. The opportunity was exactly what I had been working toward, a chance to expand my impact and influence in the field of environmental justice. But accepting the promotion would mean even less time for family visits and even more distance from the life my family expected me to be living. When I called to share the news about the promotion, hoping for congratulations and support, the response was disappointing but not surprising. My parents expressed concern about the demanding schedule and the amount of travel required, worrying that I was becoming too focused on work and not paying enough attention to personal relationships. They seemed to view the promotion as evidence that I was moving further away from the possibility of returning to a more family-centered life. The conversation revealed the fundamental disconnect between my family's priorities and my own. They saw career advancement as valuable only if it served the larger goal of family stability and community connection. I saw my professional growth as a way to serve communities like ours, to use my skills in education to address problems that affected people I cared about. We were talking about the same job, but we were interpreting its significance in completely different ways. This misunderstanding extended to my personal life as well. My family worried that my focus on environmental work was preventing me from finding a husband and starting a family of my own. They couldn't understand that I was building a different kind of life, one that was fulfilling and meaningful, even if it didn't follow the traditional patterns they expected. The questions about my dating life and future family plans became increasingly frequent and pointed during family gatherings. Aunts and cousins would ask when I was going to settle down and start thinking about what really mattered in life. The implication was clear. My career was a temporary distraction from my real purpose as a woman, which was to support a husband and raise children. These expectations were particularly frustrating because they seemed to apply only to me. Daniel's dedication to his career was never questioned or seen as incompatible with family life. His long hours and business travel were viewed as necessary sacrifices for the family's success, while my similar commitment to my work was seen as evidence that I had my priorities wrong. The double standard was especially apparent when Daniel got married during my fourth year in Portland. The entire family rallied around the wedding planning, with everyone contributing time, money, and effort to make sure the celebration reflected the family's values and status. Daniel's bride was welcomed into the family with enthusiasm and immediately given important roles in family activities and decision-making. Watching the way Daniel's marriage strengthened his position within the family made me acutely aware of how my choices had weakened mine. His wedding was treated as a family triumph, evidence that he was successfully building on the foundation his parents had provided. My career achievements, by contrast, were seen as individual accomplishments that had little relevance to the family's collective success. The wedding itself was both beautiful and painful for me. I was honored to be included in the celebration and genuinely happy for Daniel and his new wife. But I also felt like an outsider looking in, watching my family celebrate a life path that I had chosen not to follow. The joy and approval surrounding Daniel's marriage highlighted the disappointment and concern that surrounded my career choices. During the wedding reception, I found myself having the same conversations over and over again with family members who wanted to know when I would follow Daniel's example and start focusing on building a family of my own. The questions were well-intentioned but deeply frustrating, based on the assumption that my current life was somehow incomplete or temporary. The most painful moment came when Grandpa Mike pulled me aside during the reception and told me how proud he was of the work I was doing in Oregon. He was the only family member who seemed to understand that my career was not a phase or a distraction, but a calling that deserved the same respect and support that Daniel's business career received. "Mija," he said, "don't let them make you feel like you have to choose between family and following your heart. The best way to honor your family is to use your gifts to help people, even if they don't understand how you're doing it." Those words from Grandpa Mike were like a lifeline during a very difficult period. They reminded me that at least one person in my family understood and supported my choices, even if he was the only one. His validation gave me the strength to continue pursuing my career path despite the ongoing disapproval and misunderstanding from other family members. But Grandpa Mike's support also made me more aware of my isolation within the family. Having one ally highlighted how few people truly understood or accepted my life choices. It made me realize that I was holding on to my connection to the family, largely because of my relationship with him, and it made me wonder what would happen to that connection if something happened to him. The thought of losing Grandpa Mike was too painful to contemplate, so I pushed it aside and focused on making the most of the time I had with him. During my visits home, I would spend hours talking with him about my work, sharing stories about the communities I was helping and the policies I was trying to change. He would listen with genuine interest and ask thoughtful questions that showed he understood the importance of what I was doing. These conversations with Grandpa Mike were precious to me because they were the only times I felt truly seen and understood by a family member. He didn't just tolerate my career choices, he celebrated them. He didn't just accept my independence, he admired it. He saw my work as a natural extension of the family's values, rather than a rejection of them. Looking back, I realized that Grandpa Mike was trying to prepare me for the challenges I would face as the family member who had chosen a different path. He was teaching me to value my own judgment and to trust my instincts, even when they led me away from family expectations. He was showing me that it was possible to maintain family connections while pursuing individual goals, but that it required strength and persistence. The lessons Grandpa Mike taught me during those conversations became even more important as my relationship with the rest of the family continued to deteriorate. The more successful I became in my environmental work, the more distant I felt from the people who had raised me. The more recognition I received for my advocacy efforts, the less valued I felt within my own family. This paradox was particularly difficult to navigate because it seemed to contradict everything I had been taught about family loyalty and the importance of maintaining connections to your roots. I had been raised to believe that family relationships were the most important thing in life, that personal achievements meant nothing if they came at the expense of family harmony. But my experience was teaching me that sometimes family harmony required some members to sacrifice their authentic selves, to abandon their dreams and passions, in order to fit into roles that others had chosen for them. The price of family acceptance seemed to be the surrender of individual identity, and I was no longer willing to pay that price. The realization that I might have to choose between family acceptance and personal authenticity was devastating. It felt like a betrayal of everything I had been taught about the importance of family relationships. But it also felt like the only way to maintain my integrity and continue pursuing work that felt meaningful and important to me. As my 5th year in Portland began, I found myself preparing for the possibility that I might have to accept a permanent estrangement from my family. The thought was heartbreaking, but it also felt like the logical conclusion of a process that had been building for years. I couldn't keep pretending that my career choices were temporary or that I would eventually return to the life my family wanted me to live. The annual reunion at Millerton Lake was approaching, and I was dreading it more than ever before. Previous reunions had been difficult, but this one felt different. I sensed that the family's patience with my phase was running out, that they were expecting me to announce some change in direction that would bring me back into the fold. I knew that I was going to disappoint them again, and I wasn't sure how much more disappointment our relationships could withstand. The phone call from Mom inviting me to the reunion was notably brief and formal. She provided the basic information about dates and logistics but didn't ask about my work or my life in Oregon. The conversation felt like a duty being fulfilled, rather than a genuine expression of interest in my well-being. I accepted the invitation, but I did so with a heavy heart and low expectations. As I prepared for what might be my last family reunion, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. I had followed my dreams and built a successful career in environmental advocacy. I I had made a real difference in the lives of communities that needed protection and support. I had stayed true to my values and used my education to serve purposes that felt meaningful and important. But I had also become estranged from the people who had given me those values in the first place. I had achieved professional success at the cost of family acceptance. I had gained the respect of colleagues and community leaders, while losing the approval of the people whose opinions had once mattered most to me. The irony was that my work was actually serving the same goals that had always been important to my family: protecting communities, supporting families, and fighting for justice. But because I was doing this work in a different context, and with different methods, my family couldn't see the connection between my career and their values. As I drove toward Millerton Lake for what I expected to be a final reunion, I was filled with sadness about the relationships that seemed to be ending and uncertainty about what would come next. I had built a life that felt authentic and meaningful, but it was a life that apparently couldn't coexist with the family connections that had once defined my identity. The reunion would force me to confront the reality of my situation, to acknowledge that I had chosen a path that led away from family acceptance and toward professional fulfillment. It would require me to decide whether I was willing to continue fighting for relationships that seemed to have no room for the person I had become, or whether it was time to accept that some bridges had been burned beyond repair. I was about to discover that sometimes the most important family relationships are not the ones you're born into, but the ones that choose to support you when you need it most. And sometimes the people who understand you best are the ones who have been quietly watching and waiting for the right moment to show you that love and acceptance were there all along, even when you couldn't see them. The subtle changes in family communication started 3 months before the reunion, so gradually that I almost missed them entirely. What began as minor shifts in tone and timing evolved into a pattern of exclusion that left me feeling increasingly isolated from the people I loved most. The family group chat that had once been a constant source of connection became a space where my contributions were met with silence or polite but distant responses. Sophia's messages to me became less frequent and more formal, losing the casual warmth that had characterized our sister relationship for years. Where she once shared daily details about her students, her husband, and her plans for the weekend, her communications became limited to basic updates about family events and logistics. When I asked about her new teaching position or her recent vacation, her responses were brief and lacking the enthusiasm she had always shown when discussing her life. Daniel's transformation was even more pronounced. My older brother had never been particularly talkative, but he had always included me in family business discussions and asked for my perspective on various issues. His messages had often contained subtle requests for advice about financial matters or business decisions, acknowledging my expertise in ways that made me feel valued and connected to the family's operations. But as the reunion approached, these consultations stopped entirely, replaced by formal notifications about family meetings and decisions that had already been made without my input. The most painful change was in my parents' communication style. Mom's phone calls became shorter and more superficial, focused on weather updates and general health inquiries, rather than the deeper conversations about life goals and personal challenges that had sustained our relationship through my years in Portland. Dad's messages, never frequent to begin with, became purely functional, limited to necessary information about family events and business matters that required my attention. The shift was so gradual that I initially attributed it to busy schedules and the natural evolution of family relationships as everyone got older and more focused on their individual responsibilities. But as the pattern continued and intensified, I began to recognize it as something more deliberate and concerning. The family was pulling away from me in coordinated fashion, creating distance that felt intentional rather than accidental. My attempts to address the communication changes were met with reassurances that everything was fine and that I was probably just being overly sensitive. When I mentioned to Sophia that I felt like I was hearing less from everyone, she insisted that nothing had changed and that everyone was simply busy with their own lives. When I asked Mom if there was something wrong, she seemed genuinely confused by my concern and assured me that the family's feelings toward me hadn't changed. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Family photos posted on social media showed gatherings that I hadn't been told about, casual get-togethers that apparently didn't warrant my inclusion or even my knowledge, business decisions that would have previously been discussed with me were being made and implemented without my input. Social events that I had helped organize in previous years were being planned and executed by others, with my role reduced to receiving invitations rather than participating in the coordination. The exclusion was particularly evident in the planning process for Grandpa Mike's birthday celebration, which was scheduled to be the centerpiece of the annual reunion. In previous years, I had been actively involved in organizing these milestone celebrations, contributing ideas for gifts, activities, and special surprises that would make the event memorable. But this year, the planning was happening without me, with family members making decisions and assignments that I learned about through casual mentions rather than direct involvement. When I offered to help with the birthday celebration planning, my suggestions were politely received but ultimately ignored. The photo slideshow that I had offered to create was assigned to someone else. The special gift that I had proposed was replaced with an alternative that had been chosen by other family members. The decorations that I had volunteered to handle were being managed by a different committee that had been formed without my knowledge or participation. The message was clear. My contributions were no longer needed or wanted, and my presence was being tolerated rather than valued. The family had found ways to function without me, and they seemed to prefer these new arrangements to the inclusion and collaboration that had previously characterized our relationships. The impact of this gradual exclusion on my emotional well-being was profound and multifaceted. I found myself second-guessing every interaction with family members, analyzing their words and tone for signs of disapproval or rejection. I became hypervigilant about family communications, checking for messages that might indicate whether my status within the family was improving or deteriorating. I began to dread phone calls from home, anticipating conversations that would leave me feeling more isolated and misunderstood than before. The professional success that I had achieved in Portland, which should have been a source of pride and satisfaction, began to feel hollow and meaningless in the context of my deteriorating family relationships. The recognition that I was receiving for my environmental advocacy work couldn't compensate for the growing sense that I was losing the people who had shaped my identity and values. Each professional achievement felt like another step away from family acceptance, another reminder that my choices had created irreparable distance between myself and the people I loved most. The anticipation of the reunion became a source of constant anxiety rather than excited expectation. In previous years, I had looked forward to the gathering as an opportunity to reconnect with family members, share stories about my life and work, and participate in the traditions that had defined our family identity for decades. But this year, the reunion felt like a test that I was destined to fail, a final opportunity to prove my worth to people who had already decided that I didn't measure up to their expectations. My work performance began to suffer as I became increasingly distracted by family concerns and uncertainty about my future relationships with the people who had raised me. Colleagues noticed that I seemed less focused and engaged, and my supervisor expressed concern about my apparent lack of enthusiasm for projects that had previously excited me. The environmental advocacy work that had once felt like a calling began to feel like a burden, a career choice that had cost me too much in terms of personal relationships and family connections. The isolation was compounded by the fact that I had few friends in Portland who could understand the complexity of my situation. Most of my colleagues came from families that had supported their career choices, and they couldn't relate to the experience of being rejected by the people who had once been your primary source of emotional support. The cultural expectations that shaped my family's disapproval were foreign to most of my friends, who had grown up in environments where individual achievement and independence were celebrated, rather than seen as threats to family unity. As the reunion date approached, I found myself dreading the trip to Millerton Lake, while simultaneously hoping that the gathering would somehow repair the damage that had been done to my family relationships. I fantasized about conversations that would help everyone understand my perspective and appreciate the value of my work. I imagined moments of connection and reconciliation that would restore the warmth and acceptance that had once characterized my place within the family. But I also prepared myself for the possibility that the reunion would confirm my worst fears about the permanence of my exile from the family's inner circle. I researched hotels in the area where I could stay if the atmosphere at the lake house became too uncomfortable. I made backup plans for activities that I could pursue alone if I found myself excluded from family events. I even considered the possibility of leaving the reunion early, if it became clear that my presence was more of a burden than a blessing for the other family members. The week before the reunion, I received a phone call from cousin Marco that provided some insight into the family's current perspective on my situation. Marco had always been one of the family members who seemed most understanding of my choices, and his call felt like an attempt to prepare me for what I might encounter at the lake house. "Emma," he said carefully, "I think you should know that there's been some talk in the family about your situation. Some people are concerned that you've become too distant, too focused on your career, to really be part of the family anymore. They're worried that you look down on the rest of us because of your education and your fancy job." The accusation stung because it was so far from the truth. I had never looked down on my family or considered myself superior because of my career achievements. If anything, I had always felt insecure about my place within the family, constantly worried that I wasn't measuring up to their expectations or contributing enough to their collective success. "Marco," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, "I've never felt superior to anyone in the family. I love and respect all of you, and I'm proud of everything our family has accomplished. I chose my career because I believe it's important work, not because I think it makes me better than anyone else." "I know that," Marco said gently, "and I've tried to explain that to people. But you have to understand that from their perspective, it looks like you've rejected everything the family stands for. You moved far away, you work with people they don't know, and you've built a life that doesn't seem to have room for the family that raised you." The conversation with Marco helped me understand how my choices had been interpreted by family members, but it also made me realize how little hope there was for changing their perceptions. The narrative about my arrogance and rejection of family values had apparently become entrenched within the family, and my presence at the reunion was unlikely to alter these deeply held beliefs. I spent the drive to Millerton Lake thinking about Marco's words and preparing myself for the challenging dynamics that awaited me at the lake house. I tried to develop strategies for responding to criticism without becoming defensive, for maintaining my dignity while also expressing my love for the family. I rehearsed explanations of my career choices that might help family members understand my motivations and appreciate the value of my work. But I also steeled myself for the possibility that these efforts would be unsuccessful, that the reunion would confirm the family's belief that I had chosen my career over family relationships. I prepared myself for conversations that would leave me feeling more isolated and misunderstood than ever before, and I made peace with the possibility that this might be my last attempt to maintain connections with people who no longer seemed to value my presence in their lives. The arrival at the lake house was immediately uncomfortable in ways that I had never experienced before. The warm greetings and enthusiastic welcomes that had characterized previous reunions were replaced by polite but distant acknowledgments of my presence. Family members seemed to be going through the motions of hospitality without the genuine warmth that had always made the reunions feel like true homecomings. Sophia's greeting was particularly painful because it highlighted how much our relationship had changed. Where she had once rushed to embrace me and immediately launched into excited updates about her life, she now offered a brief hug and a formal inquiry about my trip. The conversation that followed was stilted and awkward, filled with the kind of polite questions that you might ask an acquaintance rather than a beloved sister. Daniel's interaction was even more telling. He acknowledged my arrival with a nod and a brief, "Good to see you," but there was no warmth in his expression and no indication that he was genuinely pleased by my presence. He seemed to be tolerating my participation in the family gathering rather than welcoming it, and his body language suggested that he would prefer to minimize our interactions throughout the weekend. The most devastating greeting came from my parents, who seemed to be treating me like a distant relative rather than their daughter. Mom's hug was brief and perfunctory, lacking the lingering embrace that had always conveyed her love and pride in my accomplishments. Dad's handshake was formal and businesslike, appropriate for a business associate, but heartbreakingly inappropriate for a father welcoming his daughter home. The sleeping arrangements provided another indication of my changed status within the family. In previous years, I had been assigned to one of the better bedrooms in the main house, reflecting my position as one of the immediate family members. But this year, I was directed to a small guest room that was typically reserved for more distant relatives or family friends. The room assignment was presented as a practical matter related to the number of people attending the reunion, but it felt like a symbolic demotion that reflected my reduced importance within the family hierarchy. The first evening's activities confirmed my worst fears about the reunion dynamics. The traditional welcome dinner was organized around conversations and activities that seemed designed to exclude me from meaningful participation. Business discussions focused on developments in the landscaping company that I knew nothing about, having been excluded from the planning and decision-making processes. Social conversations centered on local events and people that I had no connection to, emphasizing my status as an outsider who had chosen to build her life elsewhere. When I attempted to contribute to conversations about community issues or business challenges, my comments were politely acknowledged but quickly dismissed or ignored. Family members seemed to be waiting for me to stop talking so they could return to discussions that didn't include perspectives from outside their immediate circle. The expertise that I had developed in environmental advocacy, which could have been valuable for addressing some of the challenges facing the family business, was treated as irrelevant and unwelcome. The most painful moment of the evening came when Uncle Tony was discussing challenges related to water usage regulations that were affecting the landscaping business. I had extensive knowledge about these regulations and had worked on similar issues in Oregon, but when I offered to share information that might be helpful, he dismissed my contribution with a wave of his hand and a comment about how those environmental people didn't understand the practical realities of running a business. The dismissal was particularly hurtful because it revealed how my family viewed my professional expertise. Rather than seeing my environmental knowledge as a valuable resource that could benefit the family business, they saw it as evidence of my alignment with forces that were hostile to their interests. My career achievements weren't just irrelevant to them, they were actively suspicious and threatening. As the evening progressed, I found myself increasingly isolated from the family conversations and activities. I was present in the same room as my relatives, but I was not truly included in their interactions. I was being tolerated rather than welcomed, accommodated rather than celebrated. The reunion that I had hoped would repair my relationships with family members was instead confirming that those relationships had been damaged beyond repair. The second day of the reunion brought the traditional family activities that had always been highlights of our gatherings: the fishing tournament, the volleyball games, the elaborate barbecue that brought together multiple generations of Rodriguez family members. But even these beloved traditions felt different this year, marked by subtle but unmistakable signs that I was no longer considered a full participant in family life. The fishing tournament, which had always been a source of friendly competition and shared laughter, became an exercise in exclusion. The boats were organized in a way that left me partnered with the least enthusiastic participants, while the serious competitors were grouped together in combinations that obviously hadn't included consideration of my presence. The conversations during the fishing expedition were polite, but superficial, lacking the intimate family sharing that had always made these activities meaningful. The volleyball games were even more revealing. Family members seemed to be deliberately avoiding choosing me for their teams, and when I was finally selected, it felt like a reluctant accommodation, rather than a genuine desire for my participation. The easy camaraderie that had characterized previous games was replaced by a formal politeness that made it clear I was being included out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. But it was the photography that provided the most concrete evidence of my changed status within the family. Throughout the reunion, family members were constantly taking pictures of various activities and group configurations, but I noticed that I was rarely included in these photos. When group pictures were being organized, I was frequently asked to take the photo rather than be in it, or I would somehow be occupied with other tasks when the pictures were being taken. The pattern was so consistent that it couldn't be accidental. Family members were deliberately documenting their reunion activities in ways that minimized or eliminated my presence. The photos that would be shared on social media and displayed in family homes would tell a story of family unity and celebration that didn't include me. I was being edited out of the family narrative, literally erased from the visual record of our shared experiences. The most devastating moment came during the organization of the annual family portrait, the formal group photo that serves as the official record of each year's reunion. This photograph had always been a serious and important tradition, with careful attention paid to positioning and appearance. Every family member was expected to participate, and the resulting photo was displayed prominently in family homes and shared widely within the extended family network. But this year, when the family was gathering for the portrait, I was asked to operate the camera instead of being in the picture. The request was presented as a practical matter, with Dad explaining that my experience with photography made me the logical choice to ensure that the picture turned out well. But the real message was unmistakable. I was no longer considered enough of a family member to deserve inclusion in the official family portrait. Standing behind the camera, looking through the viewfinder at the faces of people I had loved my entire life, I felt a profound sense of loss and abandonment. The family was literally posing without me, arranging themselves in a configuration that didn't include space for my presence. They were creating a visual record of their family identity that excluded me entirely, as if I had never been part of their story. The photo session continued for what felt like hours, with different groupings and arrangements that explored every possible combination of family members, except those that included me. The parents with their successful children, the grandchildren with their accomplished aunt and uncle, the business partners who were building the family legacy together. Every meaningful family relationship was documented and celebrated, while I remained invisible behind the camera. As I took photo after photo of my family's happiness and unity, I realized that this was my answer to the question that had been troubling me for months. The family had not just grown distant from me, they had actively decided to exclude me from their story. I was no longer their daughter, sister, or granddaughter in any meaningful sense. I was a former family member who was being politely tolerated until she got the message and stopped trying to maintain connections that were no longer wanted. The realization was crushing, but it was also clarifying. I finally understood that my efforts to maintain family relationships had been futile because the family had already decided that my choices made me incompatible with their values and expectations. They hadn't been gradually pulling away from me. They had been gradually pushing me away, creating distance that would eventually become permanent separation. The photography session ended with the family members dispersing to other activities, leaving me alone with the camera and the painful knowledge that I had just documented my own exclusion from the family that had raised me. The images I had captured would become treasured memories for everyone else, but for me, they would serve as evidence of the love and acceptance that I had lost through my choices. As I walked back to my assigned guest room, I felt a profound sense of grief for the relationships that had been damaged beyond repair. The family that I had tried so hard to maintain connections with had already moved on without me, creating new traditions and dynamics that didn't include my presence. I was mourning the loss of people who were still alive, grieving for relationships that had died while I was still hoping to save them. The evening brought more of the same treatment, with family members interacting with me in ways that were polite but distant, cordial but not warm. I was included in group activities, but not in the intimate conversations that gave those activities meaning. I was fed and housed and acknowledged, but I was not truly welcomed or valued. The final blow came during the traditional storytelling session around the campfire, when family members shared memories and anecdotes that celebrated the family's history and values. In previous years, I had been an active participant in these sessions, sharing stories about my own experiences and contributing to the collective narrative of family identity. But this year, the stories were chosen and told in ways that seemed to exclude my experiences and minimize my contributions to family history. The narrative being constructed around the campfire was one of family unity and shared values, but it was a narrative that didn't have room for the family member who had chosen a different path. As I listened to story after story that celebrated family members who had stayed close to home and followed traditional paths, I realized that my own story was being quietly erased from the family history. The achievements and experiences that had defined my adult life were being treated as irrelevant to the family's collective identity. I was becoming a footnote in the family story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of straying too far from traditional expectations. The night ended with me lying in my assigned guest room, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the emotional devastation of the day. I had come to the reunion hoping to repair damaged relationships, but instead I had discovered that those relationships were beyond repair. The family that I had loved and tried to serve through my environmental work had decided that my service was unwanted and my love was insufficient to overcome their disapproval of my choices. The pain was overwhelming, but it was also liberating in a strange way. I finally had clarity about my situation and could stop hoping for acceptance that was never going to come. I could stop trying to bridge a gap that the family had no interest in closing. I could stop sacrificing my own well-being in pursuit of approval that was permanently out of reach. But even as I accepted the reality of my situation, I couldn't bring myself to regret the choices that had led me to this point. My environmental advocacy work was important and meaningful, even if my family couldn't understand or appreciate it. My independence and self-reliance were valuable qualities, even if they were seen as threats to family unity. My education and expertise were assets that could benefit communities and causes that mattered, even if they were dismissed as irrelevant by the people who had raised me. The reunion had taught me that family acceptance was not worth the price of abandoning my authentic self. The love and approval that I had been seeking were available only on condition that I become someone I was not. Someone who would prioritize family expectations over personal integrity. That was a bargain that I was no longer willing to make. As I prepared for sleep, I began to think about the future and what it might hold for someone who had been effectively orphaned by her own choices. I would need to build new support systems and find new sources of love and acceptance. I would need to create chosen family relationships that could provide the emotional sustenance that my biological family was no longer able or willing to offer. But I would also need to find ways to honor the values and lessons that my family had taught me, even as I rejected their judgment of my life choices. The commitment to service, the importance of hard work, the value of community connections. These were gifts that my family had given me, and I could carry them forward even if the family relationships themselves were ending. The reunion had been a disaster in terms of family reconciliation, but it had also been a crucial step in my journey towards self-acceptance and authentic living. I had learned that I could survive the loss of family approval, and that my worth was not dependent on their validation. I had discovered that my choices had value and meaning, even if they were not understood or appreciated by the people who had raised me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate my resilience and independence. The family that had rejected me would continue their lives without me, and I would continue mine without them. It was not the outcome I had hoped for, but it was an outcome I could accept and build upon. The reunion disaster had taught me that sometimes the most important family relationships are the ones you choose for yourself, and that the love and acceptance you seek might be found in unexpected places with unexpected people. The biological family that had shaped my early years was no longer able to support the person I had become, but that didn't mean I was doomed to a life without family connections. As I finally drifted off to sleep in my assigned guest room, I was filled with sadness about the relationships that were ending, but also with hope about the relationships that were yet to begin. The reunion had been a painful conclusion to one chapter of my life, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter in which I would define family on my own terms and seek acceptance from people who were capable of appreciating my authentic self. The third morning at Millerton Lake brought an unexpected announcement that would change everything. Mr. Henderson, the family's longtime attorney, had driven up from Fresno during the night and was waiting in the main cabin's living room with a leather briefcase and a somber expression that immediately caught everyone's attention. Mom gathered the family together after breakfast, her voice carrying an unusual tension, as she explained that Grandpa Mike had left specific instructions for his will to be read during this reunion weekend. He wanted all of us together when his final wishes were shared, she said, wringing her hands nervously. Mr. Henderson says it was very important to Grandpa Mike that this happen exactly as he requested, with the whole family present at the lake house. The timing felt surreal and deeply painful. After 2 days of being treated like an unwelcome outsider, I was now expected to sit through a formal legal proceeding that would likely emphasize my diminished status within the family structure. I assumed that Grandpa Mike's will would follow conventional patterns, with the bulk of his estate going to Dad and the business, smaller bequests distributed among the grandchildren, and perhaps some personal items designated for various family members based on sentimental value. As we assembled in the living room where so many family meetings had taken place over the years, I positioned myself in a chair slightly removed from the main family grouping. The seating arrangement felt symbolic of my current relationship with everyone present, close enough to observe and participate, but clearly separate from the core family unit. Daniel and Sophia sat with our parents on the main couch, while aunts, uncles, and cousins filled the remaining chairs in a circle that seemed to naturally exclude the space where I was sitting. Mr. Henderson had known our family for over 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to real estate transactions to various legal matters that arose as Rodriguez Landscaping expanded and prospered. His presence at family events wasn't unusual, but there was something different about his demeanor this morning, a careful formality that suggested he was prepared for reactions that might be surprising or difficult. He began with the standard legal language that opens most wills, the formal declarations and procedural requirements that establish the document's validity and legal standing. The room was unusually quiet as he read through these preliminary sections, with family members listening respectfully but without particular engagement. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the substantive portions that would reveal how Grandpa Mike had chosen to distribute his considerable assets. The first specific bequests were predictable and well received. Dad inherited the landscaping business, along with all its properties, equipment, and ongoing contracts. The announcement was met with solemn nods of approval, as this outcome had been expected and planned for many years. Daniel's eventual succession to business leadership was confirmed through provisions that ensured continuity of management and family control over the company that Grandpa Mike had built from nothing. Mom received Grandpa Mike's vintage car collection and his extensive library of business books, along with a substantial cash bequest that would ensure her financial security regardless of what happened with the business in future years. Sophia was granted the family's cookbook collection and recipe archive, along with Grandpa Mike's china and formal dining room furniture, items that reflected her role as the family's social coordinator and hostess for future gatherings. Various cousins and extended family members received personal items that held special meaning, tools and equipment that reflected shared interests, and modest financial bequests that acknowledged their relationships with Grandpa Mike without creating any dramatic changes in their life circumstances. The distribution pattern seemed thoughtful and appropriate, reflecting Grandpa Mike's understanding of each family member's personality and circumstances. As Mr. Henderson worked through these conventional bequests, I found myself wondering what, if anything, had been designated for me. Given my current status within the family, I wasn't expecting anything significant, but I hoped that perhaps Grandpa Mike had left me some small personal item that would serve as a reminder of our special relationship and his understanding of my choices. When Mr. Henderson finally reached the section of the will that addressed my inheritance, the words he spoke were so unexpected that I initially thought I had misheard him. To my granddaughter Emma Rodriguez, I leave the Millerton Lake property in its entirety, including the main cabin, all outbuildings, the boat dock, and the surrounding 23 acres of land. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the lake water lapping against the shore outside. Every person in the room seemed to be frozen in shock, trying to process the implications of what they had just heard. The lake property wasn't just valuable real estate. It was the emotional and symbolic heart of our family's identity, the place where our most important memories had been created, and our traditions had been maintained for over 2 decades. But Mr. Henderson wasn't finished with the surprises. Additionally, Emma Rodriguez inherits the investment portfolio that Mr. Miguel Rodriguez established specifically for the maintenance and improvement of the lake property, currently valued at approximately $450,000. The financial implications were staggering, but the emotional significance was even more profound. Grandpa Mike had entrusted me with preserving and maintaining the place that meant more to our family than any other location on Earth. He had given me the responsibility for ensuring that future generations of Rodriguez family members would continue to have access to the traditions and experiences that had shaped our collective identity. As the reality of the inheritance began to sink in, I became aware of the expressions on my family members' faces. Dad looked like he had been physically struck, his mouth slightly open and his eyes wide with disbelief. Mom was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, her previous assumptions about my place in the family clearly being rapidly revised. Daniel's face showed a mixture of confusion and concern, while Sophia appeared to be struggling to process how this development would affect her own relationship with family traditions and responsibilities. The extended family members seemed equally stunned, with whispered conversations beginning to break out as people tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Uncle Tony was shaking his head slowly, while Aunt Carmen kept looking back and forth between me and Mr. Henderson, as if waiting for someone to explain that a mistake had been made. But Mr. Henderson had additional revelations that would make the situation even more complex and emotionally charged. Mr. Rodriguez also requested that I read a personal letter he wrote specifically for this occasion, he announced, unfolding several pages covered in Grandpa Mike's distinctive handwriting. "My beloved family," Mr. Henderson began reading, "if you are hearing these words, then I am no longer with you, and you are gathered together at the lake house that has been the center of our family life for so many years. I hope this will be the first of many reunions that Emma will host for all of you in this special place." The mention of me hosting future reunions caused several family members to shift uncomfortably in their seats, clearly struggling to reconcile this vision with their recent treatment of me. The letter was positioning me not just as the inheritor of the property, but as the future guardian of family traditions and gatherings. "I am leaving the lake house to Emma because she alone among my grandchildren understands what family truly means," Mr. Henderson continued reading. "While others have focused on maintaining appearances and conforming to expectations, Emma has demonstrated the courage to pursue her convictions, even when doing so required personal sacrifice and family disapproval. I could feel every eye in the room focusing on me, but I kept my gaze fixed on Mr. Henderson, afraid that looking at anyone else might break my composure entirely." Grandpa Mike's words were validating everything I had believed about my choices, while simultaneously challenging everything my family had assumed about my motivations. "Emma's environmental advocacy work is not a rejection of our family values or heritage," the letter continued. "It is the highest expression of those values, representing a commitment to protecting and serving communities like ours. She has never forgotten where she came from, but she has had the wisdom to understand where she was most needed." The lawyer paused, allowing these words to resonate before continuing with what would prove to be the most devastating portion of the letter. "I have watched with growing concern, as this family has treated Emma as if her achievements and choices were somehow less valuable than conformity to traditional expectations. I have observed the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that she has been excluded from family activities and decision-making processes. My heart was pounding so hard that I was certain everyone could hear it. Grandpa Mike had been paying attention to everything, had noticed the gradual erosion of my place within the family, and had chosen to address it in the most public and definitive way possible. The exclusion of Emma from family photographs during this reunion is particularly disappointing and unworthy of the Rodriguez name," Mr. Henderson read, his voice carrying a note of reproach that seemed to be directed at everyone present except me. "Family is not about maintaining comfortable illusions or rewarding only those choices that require no courage or sacrifice." The reference to the photograph sent a visible shock through the room. Several family members exchanged guilty glances, apparently realizing that their deliberate exclusion of me from family pictures had been observed and documented by someone whose opinion they valued more than they had realized. "The lake house represents everything our family should stand for: acceptance, inclusion, and unconditional love," the letter continued. "Emma understands these principles better than anyone else in this room because she has experienced what it feels like to be denied them by people who should have provided them without question." Grandpa Mike's words were creating a complete reversal of the family narrative that had been developing around my choices and character. Instead of being portrayed as the selfish family member who had abandoned her responsibilities, I was being celebrated as the person who best embodied the family's true values. "I am also leaving Emma my personal savings and investment accounts, totaling approximately $600,000, because I trust her judgment about how resources should be used to help people," Mr. Henderson continued reading. "Her work has demonstrated that she understands the responsibility that comes with privilege and that she will use this inheritance to create positive change in the world." The total value of what Grandpa Mike had left me was well over $1 million, making it by far the largest portion of his estate, and a clear statement about his confidence in my character and judgment. But the letter made it clear that the inheritance was about much more than money or property. It was about vindication and validation of choices that had been questioned and criticized by everyone else in the family. Finally, Mr. Henderson read, "I want to address directly the treatment that Emma has received from family members who should have been her strongest supporters. The assumption that geographic distance equals emotional distance is false and hurtful. The belief that career choices different from traditional patterns represent a rejection of family values is short-sighted and destructive." Grandpa Mike's letter was systematically dismantling every justification that the family had used for their treatment of me, challenging their assumptions and forcing them to confront the consequences of their actions. Emma has been made to feel unwelcome at family gatherings, excluded from important conversations, and treated as if her life choices were somehow a betrayal of everything we stand for, the letter continued. This treatment has dishonored our family name and contradicted every principle that I tried to instill in my children and grandchildren. The silence in the room was now heavy with shame and recognition. Family members were beginning to understand that their behavior had been observed and judged by the person whose opinion mattered most to all of them. Emma, Mija, Mr. Henderson read, addressing me directly through Grandpa Mike's words. I hope you will use this inheritance to bring our family back together on terms that honor everyone's choices and achievements. Show them what real inclusion looks like. Teach them that supporting each other's dreams is what makes a family strong, not demanding conformity to narrow expectations. The letter concluded with a direct challenge to the rest of the family. To my other children and grandchildren, I hope you will learn from Emma's example and from your own mistakes during this reunion. Family love should not be conditional on career choices or geographic proximity. Respect and inclusion should not have to be earned through conformity to traditional patterns. As Mr. Henderson folded the letter and set it aside, the room remained silent for what felt like an eternity. The legal reading was complete, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. Everything that the family thought they knew about Grandpa Mike's opinions and priorities had been revealed as incomplete or incorrect. The person they had dismissed and excluded had been chosen as the most trusted guardian of family traditions and values. The first person to speak was Aunt Carmen, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma, I had no idea that Grandpa Mike felt this way about your work, or about how we've been treating you. Uncle Tony, who had been one of the harshest critics of my career choices, looked completely stunned. I thought we were protecting family unity by encouraging you to come back home. I didn't realize we were driving you away. But it was Dad's reaction that affected me most deeply. This proud, strong man who had built his identity around being the responsible son and family leader looked completely lost and devastated. Emma, he said, his voice cracking with emotion, I don't know how to apologize for what we've done. I thought I was doing what was best for the family, but I can see now that I was wrong about everything. The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we had ever had. For the first time in years, family members were asking genuine questions about my work and my life, trying to understand the choices that they had previously dismissed without consideration. They wanted to know about the communities I was serving, the problems I was trying to solve, and the impact that my environmental advocacy was having on people's lives. Sophia was crying as she admitted that she had been jealous of my independence and had used family disapproval as a way to make herself feel superior about her more traditional choices. I was afraid that if people thought your path was valid, they might question whether my choices were interesting or important enough, she confessed. Daniel acknowledged that he had been concerned about how my different career might reflect on his own more conventional approach to success. I was worried that if you were too successful or too different, it would make people think less of what I was trying to accomplish with the business, he said. Mom's apology was the most emotional and comprehensive. Nisha, I failed you as a mother by not defending your choices and supporting your dreams. I was so focused on keeping the family together in the way I understood it, that I couldn't see how I was pushing you away. Your grandfather was right about everything, and I'm ashamed of how blind I've been. The most difficult conversation was with Dad, who took full responsibility for setting the tone that had led to my exclusion from family life. Emma, I've spent so much time worrying about maintaining the family business and preserving traditions that I lost sight of what family really means. Your grandfather built this business to serve the community and support the family, not to become a prison that trapped people in roles they didn't choose. As the afternoon progressed, family members began sharing memories of times when they had noticed my exclusion but hadn't spoken up to defend me. They acknowledged the patterns of behavior that had made me feel unwelcome and unvalued, and they expressed genuine remorse for their part in creating an environment where I felt like an outsider in my own family. The conversation gradually shifted from apologies to plans for rebuilding relationships and creating new family dynamics that could accommodate different choices and perspectives. We talked about ways to stay connected across geographic distances, methods for including everyone in family decisions regardless of their career paths, and strategies for celebrating diverse achievements, rather than only recognizing traditional forms of success. The emotional breakthrough continued into the evening, with family members taking turns to express their love and respect for me as an individual, rather than just as someone who was expected to fulfill certain family roles. They wanted to hear about my life in Portland, my friends and colleagues, my hopes for the future, and my ideas for using the inheritance to create positive change. The most meaningful moment came when Dad asked me to explain how environmental advocacy actually worked and how it connected to the values that Grandpa Mike had taught all of us. For the first time, he was genuinely interested in understanding my work, rather than defending his disapproval of it. As I shared stories about the communities I had worked with and the environmental justice issues that motivated my advocacy, I could see family members beginning to understand the connections between my career and the principles they had always claimed to value. They started to recognize that my work was actually serving people like us, protecting families and communities that faced environmental challenges similar to those affecting our own Central Valley region. The transformation in family dynamics was remarkable and rapid. Within hours, I had gone from being the excluded outsider to being the person that everyone wanted to talk with and learn from. The inheritance had obviously played a role in this change, but the shift seemed to go deeper than mere financial considerations. Grandpa Mike's letter had forced everyone to confront their own behavior and assumptions, creating an opportunity for genuine understanding and connection. The evening concluded with plans for me to host the next family reunion at the lake house, with input and assistance from everyone but ultimate authority to set the tone and structure for future gatherings. The conversation about these plans revealed how much the family dynamics had changed in just one day, with family members eager to participate in traditions that would include everyone and celebrate diverse achievements. As I prepared for bed in what was now officially my own cabin, I felt overwhelmed by the day's emotional journey. The inheritance was life-changing in practical terms, providing financial security and the responsibility for maintaining family traditions. But the validation and acceptance that had come with Grandpa Mike's letter were even more valuable, healing wounds that I had been carrying for years. The reunion that had begun as a disaster of exclusion and rejection had become a triumph of understanding and reconciliation. The family photographs that had been taken without me would now be remembered as evidence of a painful period that had been overcome through honest conversation and mutual recognition of past mistakes. The next morning brought a new family portrait session, this one organized around inclusion rather than exclusion. I stood proudly among the people I loved, holding the keys to the property that would ensure our family gatherings continued for generations to come, surrounded by family members who were finally ready to accept and celebrate the person I had become. The inheritance had given me the power to redefine what family meant for future generations of Rodriguez descendants. The lake house would remain the heart of our family identity, but it would be a heart that beat with acceptance rather than judgment, celebration rather than criticism, and love rather than conditional approval. Looking around at my family's faces as we posed for pictures that would actually include everyone, I realized that Grandpa Mike had given me something more precious than money or property. He had given me the opportunity to teach my family that love is stronger when it embraces differences rather than demanding conformity, and that the strongest families are those that support each member's authentic self rather than requiring everyone to fit predetermined molds. The reunion that had seemed destined to end my family relationships had instead transformed them into something deeper and more meaningful than they had ever been before. The exclusion and rejection that had caused so much pain had ultimately led to understanding and acceptance that felt genuine and lasting. Standing in front of the lake house that was now my responsibility and my gift to future generations, I understood that Grandpa Mike had been preparing me for this moment throughout all our private conversations about environmental justice and community service. He had seen that I possessed the courage and wisdom necessary to heal family divisions and create space for everyone to belong. The disaster had become a triumph, the exclusion had become inclusion, and the family that had seemed lost forever had been restored through the power of honest communication and unconditional love. The photographs that documented this transformation would serve as reminders that families can change and grow when they choose understanding over judgment and acceptance over conformity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.